there, art nerds. Today I'd like to share some of my tips for painting on cheaper cellulose papers. I'm going to intersperse some clips of me actually working on these papers as we talk as well, to give you guys kind of an idea of what I'm talking about. If you're new here, hi, I'm Becca Hilburn. I am a watercolor comic artist and illustrator, and I have so much experience with painting on cheaper watercolor paper. So whether you're interested in inexpensive watercolor sketchbooks, or you, for financial reasons or other choices, maybe lack of access, would prefer to work on cellulose watercolor papers, I've got you covered. So I cannot wait to share some of my favorite tips and tricks for painting on these cheap papers with you guys today. Something to keep in mind to start out with is that not all cheap cellulose papers are made the same. There are some that are better than others, and everybody's preferences are going to kind of vary. For example, I actually really like the Canson XL watercolor paper, both in the tape bound pads and in the spiral binding. It has its uses for me, but I really don't like Strathmore's inexpensive cellulose watercolor paper. I find that the texture is too regular and too pronounced, and I find the paper to be too thin. So one of my first tips is to experiment, borrow paper from friends, do paper exchanges, try out different papers, request sample packs, and figure out what you like, because not all cellulose papers are going to be the same. I've also found that mixed fiber papers like Paul Rubens, they're round blocks that claim to be cotton, but they're actually a mix of cotton and cellulose, or like Fabriano Studio papers, which I think, and I'll correct myself, are like 80% one thing, 20% the other. I found that mixed fiber papers for watercolor are kind of the worst of worst worlds. That said, I find that they're really, really fun for like inking techniques, particularly brush pen and brush inking. And I did a whole mermaid using Fabriano Studio watercolor paper with a brush because I happen to like how it's texture handled. So just because a paper isn't good for watercolor doesn't mean you can't use some of those watercolor properties for other types of art. So don't just throw out the pad, start experimenting with it and see what it can and can't do and what you like on it. I recommend finding a paper that has most of the properties you're looking for. You're going to have to sacrifice in some aspects. Do you want a pad or a spiral bound watercolor paper? Do you want capabilities similar to cotton rag like Montval here? It does a pretty decent job of doing a lot of the stuff that a cotton rag can do. Are you looking for easy to find, really accessible, most stores will carry it, or are you looking for the cheapest accessible product? Different aspects are going to take you in different directions. For example, Canson XL used to be sold at Walmart. Now they're selling Canson Graduate, which is supposed to be a little bit better. I have a pad and I still need to test it out, but you can still find XL like almost anywhere else. You can find it at Michael's, you can find it at art supply stores, you can find it online. Whereas Montval is much harder to find. And for me to find it in the size that I like to use for comic pages, I have to order it specifically through Blick. So it really kind of depends on what you're looking for. Do you need it to be super accessible because you're just constantly going through sketchbooks? Do you need it to perform in certain predictable ways so you're willing to order it in bulk and just kind of use up the stash you have? Those are things you need to kind of keep in mind as you're figuring out which papers you like. Don't fall in love with a paper that's been discontinued, like me with Moulin de Roy, or like Neptune watercolor paper. Don't fall in love with a paper that's been discontinued or is super hard to get a hold of, especially with cellulose, because they have so many peccadillos that, you know, you're gonna have a harder time finding a replacement than you might for a decent cotton rag. It's also important to understand your paper. Cellulose doesn't absorb water the way a cotton rag does, so it's going to dry entirely by evaporation, and it can't hold as much paint as cotton rag. That means you probably need to limit your layers, you need to limit your wet into wet techniques. Otherwise, you can end up with really messy paintings. And for a sketchbook, that's fine. We often learn by doing, by making mistakes, and by taking risks. So there's nothing wrong with making some pieces of art that are less impressive than others. I would also recommend, I have a 3-way rule, right? You have your brushes, you have your paper, you have your paints. And I would recommend that you don't cheap out on two of those things. So generally when I'm painting on cellulose paper like this, for best effect, I work with softer, nice brushes like the Silver Black Velvet or like quills. And I also work with professional grade paints because I find that a cotton rag paper is going to be more forgiving of a paint's sins than a cellulose paper. So for me, the investment becomes in the paints and in the brushes rather than in the paper itself. I would recommend you limit your expectations. Fewer layers, less glazing, because glazing can lift up prior layers, and this paper is less capable of wet to wet. Montval is a little bit better than that, but you're still going to see some problem areas where it dries unevenly, where you get patchiness, where you can see streaking. So you may have to learn some techniques to work around that. I also find that painting with synthetic brushes on cellulose, it tends to scrape up those prior layers. That's one of the reasons I recommend going with softer brushes. That said, cellulose paper is great for ink and wash as it's pretty easy to ink on. I find it a little bit easier to ink on than, say, a cotton rag paper. And this way you can really kind of focus on the line art rather than focusing so much on the watercolor carrying all of your rendering. You can also do this technique where you kind of over ink your watercolors with the same color, like the local color, just to kind of tie things together a little bit more. You can also do more mixed media, I have found, on a cotton rag, on a cellulose paper. And what I mean by that is you can use alcohol markers first and then do your watercolor and then do your watercolor pencils and then do your color pencils. Whereas with a cotton rag, I have found that cotton rags and alcohol markers don't mix super well together. They tend to really drain your alcohol markers very quickly. I mentioned earlier limiting your expectations. That includes working faster. For some of these little sketchbook illustrations, I spent like maybe 4 hours on it, and that is sometimes including dry time. Sometimes with these cellulose papers, it takes forever for it to dry. So that's why I kind of waffle on that, but it's fewer layers, it's fewer glazes, it's mostly just local color, it's kept really simple, and I'm using softer brushes and I'm working faster. So because the paper dries strangely, if you live in a dry environment, for example, it'll dry very quick. If you live in a humid environment, it's going to take forever to dry. Whereas with cotton rag, it absorbs the water, so it kind of holds on to that longer. It also absorbs some of the pigments. They get kind of trapped into the fibers. So you can do more with a cotton rag paper. You can layer more, you can glaze more, you can lift more, you can just work it more than you can with a cellulose. It kind of invites faster working. So if you're doing larger, more involved projects in general, I would recommend working with a cotton rag. For a sketchbook, cellulose is just fine. For a project like a comic where you're painting maybe hundreds of comic pages, that can get really expensive. You need to run it through a printer so you can print your blue lines, so you may need specific paper sizes. Comics have unusual limitations, and I have talked a lot about making comics and painting comics here on the channel, so I'm not going to get super into it. As I mentioned earlier, your preferences may vary. I would love to hear what cellulose watercolor papers you like to work with down in the comments below, but I like to work with Canson XL. I have the 2 sizes of sketchbook. You see me working in these pretty frequently in the start to finish series. You can sketch on it very easily. You can ink on it very easily. It takes watercolor decently well. It doesn't just flake off, and it doesn't dull the colors unnecessarily, but I am using professional grade paints on these paper just to ensure best results, so I'm not wasting my time. And then I also like Canson Montval, and this is a cellulose paper that was specifically designed due to a particular artist's specifications, so it handles a little bit better than a lot of the cellulose papers and even some of the cotton rag papers that I've tried. It's really consistent. I can buy it in the size that I need, but it's harder for me to find, so I need to order it online and order it in bulk when I'm starting a new chapter. But in general, it can take a lot of layers, it can take a lot of glazing, it can take a lot of reworking, it can take some wet into wet. So for a cellulose paper, it works really well for my comics And that's pretty much just what I use it for. Because it's a little harder to get a hold of, I save this for my comics, and if I'm doing standalone illustrations that need to be nicer, then I'll go work on a cotton rag paper. When it comes to cellulose paper, I'm looking for certain qualities. I like a good top tape bound so that the sheets are removable, but I also like spiral binding either to the side or to the top to keep everything organized. I'm looking for 140 pound, which in a cellulose paper like this is a little bit thicker than cardstock, and I am looking for some surface embossment. So Canson actually puts these in backwards now, so let me see if I can, probably not. But I'm looking for some surface embossment rather than just like very, very, very smooth flat paper. I'm also looking for some irregularity rather than like a regular fabric or linen texture. I don't really care for those. Now I'm looking at thicker papers for sketchbooks because these will curl, and while I do use clips and weights, I don't want to tape it down. But if you're comfortable with using thinner papers and you don't mind taping it down to prevent curling, that can also work for you. In my opinion, it isn't worth it to spend the money for 300 pound or heavier cellulose papers because you could just be buying cotton rag at that point. So that's a personal opinion sort of thing. Canson makes a watercolor artboard. It is fine. It is their Canson Montval that has been attached to some mat board. It's a really thin layer of Montval on the mat board. I've talked about it here on the channel, so I'll show you guys some clips from me working with it. I do like the structure that the artboard provided, but I wouldn't go out of my way to buy that. I would rather work on a cotton rag paper for those purposes. Those were some tips for working on inexpensive cellulose papers. If you have some that I missed, let me know down in the comments below. You sharing your expertise helps me and other artists learn and grow, and it's much appreciated. If you found this video to be helpful, please consider leaving a thumbs up. Consider subscribing for more overviews, tutorials, and reviews, and please consider sharing it with an art group, whether it is a forum or it is a Facebook group or it's a Discord server. Please consider sharing this video to help other artists, particularly if I've answered a question that you get asked pretty often. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. I look forward to seeing you guys again soon. I hope you guys will check out my start to finish watercolor tutorials, and I hope you guys will check out my comic 7-inch Cara, which you guys can read for free as a webcomic at 7inchcara.com. Have a wonderful day, guys. Hopefully this little overview helps make art a little more affordable, a little more accessible to help you guys make art a habit. Bye, guys.